The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and dying flowers. Elijah Stone lay propped against thin pillows, his body reduced to angles and hollows beneath a white sheet. 100 years had carved deep lines into his face lines that mapped a century of secrets. Outside the window, Arizona sun burned the same merciless gold it had burned 70 years ago. Marcus sat beside the bed, 18 years old, holding a leather journal so old the spine cracked when he opened it. The boy's hands shook slightly. He had driven 3 hours from Phoenix, skipping his shift at the garage because the nurse had called. "Your great-grandfather is asking for you. He says there's a story you need to hear." Elijah's eyes opened pale blue, fading to gray. His voice came out thin as paper. "You came. You said you'd tell me about great-grandma," Marcus said, "about how you met." The old man's chest rose and fell. Each breath sounded like wind through a canyon. 70 years, he whispered. "But I remember it like yesterday, the day I bought your grandmother's freedom." Marcus leaned forward. "Bought Grandpa? What are you talking about?" Elijah's gaze fixed on the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice carried weight that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Your grandmother wasn't free when I met her. She was property, a slave, and I broke the law to save her." The words hung between them like smoke. "I need to tell you the whole truth," Elijah said, "before I go, so you'll understand what freedom really costs." Marcus opened the journal to a blank page, pulled a pen from his pocket. "I'm listening." Elijah closed his eyes, and the story began. Red Willow, Arizona Territory, autumn 1883. The auction block stood in the town square like a gallows. Around it men gathered with the casual cruelty of those who had learned to see people as livestock. The smell of whiskey mixed with horse sweat and dust. Coins clinked in pockets. Someone laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. On the platform a woman stood barefoot. Her deerskin dress was torn at the hem, stained with travel and fear. Rope bound her wrists, the fibers cutting into skin that had been rubbed raw days ago. She didn't look at the crowd. Looking only made them louder. Her name was Naira, 24 years old, Apache. The name her mother had given her meant eyes bright as sun, but no one here knew that. No one here cared. To them, she was inventory. Item number 847 on a territorial ledger. The auctioneer was a fat man named Daniel Cortez. He wore a vest that strained across his belly and a smile that showed one gold tooth. In his hand he held a piece of paper yellowed and official-looking. "Certificate of Indentured Labor number 847, he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Issued by the Arizona Territory Indian Affairs Office. Starting bid $2 silver." $2. The price of 3 days' wages for a ranch hand. The price of a used saddle. The price of a human life. "2," someone shouted. "3," called another. Naira's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. Flinching made them laugh. She had learned that the hard way. $4 for the savage. Cortez grinned, slapping the platform beside her ankle. "Come on, gents. She's young, she's strong. Make it worth my time." At the edge of the crowd a man stood watching. He leaned against a hitching post, one boot crossed over the other arms, folded across his chest. His coat was the color of old dust. His hair had been bleached pale by sun and years. Elijah Stone. 30 years old, though his eyes looked older. A scar ran from his jaw to his collarbone, the kind of mark a blade leaves when it's trying to find your throat. His left shoulder hung stiff, an old cavalry wound that ached when storms were coming. Today, it ached. He had come to town for supplies, flour, coffee nails, basic things. He hadn't planned to stop at the auction, but he had heard the crowd, heard the auctioneer's voice, and something in his chest had pulled tight like a fist closing. Now he stood there watching a woman on a platform and seeing ghosts. $5, a man called out. Cortez pointed. "5 I got. Do I hear 6? Elijah pushed off the hitching post. He reached into his coat, felt the weight of his money pouch. 6 silver dollars. 2 weeks' wages from his last sale of cattle, money he needed for winter supplies. He stepped forward. 6. The word cut through the noise like a gunshot. Heads turned. The crowd went quiet enough to hear wind scraping across rooftops. Cortez hesitated, caught between greed and confusion. His eyes narrowed. "That's $6, mister. You sure?" Elijah met his gaze flat and cold. "I'm sure." Cortez glanced at the crowd, waiting for someone to bid higher. No one spoke. These men liked to watch chains being sold, but they didn't like competing with silence. The kind of silence Elijah Stone carried had sharp edges. The auctioneer shrugged. "Your loss." He pulled a knife from his belt, grabbed the rope binding Naira's wrists, and sliced through it. The fibers fell to the platform, coiling like dead snakes. Naira swayed. The sudden freedom made her dizzy. For a moment she thought she might fall. Then a hand appeared in front of her, open palm rough from work, not grabbing, just offering. She stared at it. Every instinct screamed trap. Men didn't offer. They took. But the hand stayed there, patient as stone. She took it. Elijah steadied her, then released. "Come on." 2 words. No command in them, no pity, just motion. They stepped off the platform. Behind them, the crowd muttered, disappointed. Men like these had little interest once mercy entered the transaction. Elijah led her through the narrow street to a water trough behind the feed store. The water still shimmered clean from morning refill. He dipped a tin cup and placed it in her hands. Naira hesitated. Her throat worked once muscles remembering how to want. Then she lifted the cup, drinking too fast, water spilling down her chin. She coughed. Elijah took the cup, filled it again, handed it back without a word. This time she drank slower. He pulled a folded blanket from his saddlebag, gray wool worn thin at the corners. He laid it over her shoulders, careful not to touch skin. The blanket swallowed her frame. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. The first moment in months that warmth didn't come with a price. When she looked up, he was already adjusting his saddle. "Can you ride?" She nodded, uncertain. "Hold the horn, I'll keep you steady." He mounted first, then helped her up, guiding her gently onto the front of the saddle. His hand rested near her waist, not on it. Close enough to catch her if she slipped. Nothing more. She held the blanket tight and looked straight ahead as he turned the horse toward the road leading out of town. Behind them, Cortez's laughter echoed faintly through the wind. They rode for miles before either spoke again. Red willow shrank behind them until it was only a smear of smoke against the horizon. The land opened wide. Dry grass, low mesas, sky too big for mercy. The horse's hooves drummed steady against packed dirt. Elijah slowed the pace when he noticed the tremor in her shoulders. Cold. She didn't answer, just tightened the blanket. He shifted his coat open enough to block wind from her side. She noticed but said nothing. Gratitude was still a language she didn't trust. When the road curved toward hills, he stopped by a patch of scrub oak. "Rest a minute." He dismounted, then offered his hand again. She slipped down, light as breath, and landed awkwardly, knees shaking. He steadied her elbow, then stepped back. She crouched, touched dirt with her fingertips, held it there. The soil was dry, still warm from sun, but it was earth, not wagon floorboards, not the iron belly of a cage. Elijah watched without speaking. He took out his knife and cut the last length of rope still hanging from her wrist. Instead of tossing it away, he knelt, dug a small hole at the base of a rock, and buried it. He covered it with dust and patted the ground once like a man sealing a grave. Naira watched him smooth the dirt. He didn't say what it meant. He didn't have to. When he looked up, their eyes met for the first time. Really met. "Eat," he said, handing her a strip of jerky. She took a bite, chewing slow. He ate a smaller piece himself, standing guard without making it obvious. A hawk circled above them, a dark fleck against pale sky. "Your name?" he asked after a while. She hesitated, tasting the English on her tongue like something sharp. "Naira." He nodded. "Elijah Stone." Their names hung between them. The first trade made freely that day. By dusk, the air turned colder. They followed a dry creek bed toward the distant outline of Elijah's ranch. The horizon blazed in copper light. Every shadow stretched long like a warning. When the cabin finally came into view, Naira blinked as if unsure it was real. A small wooden house crouched near a split rail fence. One corner of the roof sagged slightly. Smoke drifted thin from the chimney. It wasn't much, but it stood. And it was quiet. Elijah dismounted, winced as his shoulder caught. "Here," he said, motioning for her to wait while he tied the horse. Then he offered his hand again for balance as she climbed down. She touched it briefly, then pulled away, keeping distance. Inside the cabin smelled of dry wood and old leather. A cast-iron stove squatted near the far wall, still warm from morning fire. Dimensions 16 feet by 20, timber frame, tin roof, stone chimney. There was one bed, iron frame with a thin mattress. A table with 2 chairs. Shelves lined with jars. 10 pounds of dried beans, 5 pounds of flour, salt, 2 pounds of coffee. Everything was neat, not polished. The kind of order that belonged to someone who had learned to live alone. Elijah pointed toward the chair nearest the stove. "Sit." She hesitated. He nodded once. She sat slowly, eyes darting to him, waiting for correction. None came. He ladled beans from a pot on the stove into a tin bowl, set it before her, stepped back. Standard cavalry ration, 1/2 pound of beans boiled with salt pork. She stared at it, then at him. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. After a moment, she ate, fast at first, then slower when she realized he wouldn't take it away. When the bowl was empty, he filled it again without asking. Her hands trembled less now. The firelight caught her cheekbones sharp from hunger and the bruises along her neck. Elijah saw but didn't ask. Some stories didn't need telling on the first night. He reached into a trunk near the bed, pulled out a clean cotton shirt, laid it across the blanket. "You can change. I'll check the barn." She waited until the door shut behind him before standing. The blanket slipped to her elbows as she lifted the shirt. It smelled of soap and smoke, soft from years of washing. She slipped it on. The hem fell nearly to her knees. She wrapped the wool blanket around her waist like a skirt. The cabin's stillness pressed against her ears. No shouting, no chains clinking, just the tick of cooling metal and the small crackle of wood. She exhaled for what felt like the first time. Outside, Elijah fed the horse, checked the corral fence, stayed gone longer than needed. Mercy, he had learned, was best given space to breathe. When he returned, she was sitting again, straighter this time, the firelight softening her face. He added another log to the stove. "Fire will hold till morning." Then he spread his coat on the floor near the door, rolling it into a pillow. He pointed toward the bed. "You take that, I'll stay here." Her brow creased. No man had ever offered comfort without a price. She shook her head quickly, clutching the blanket. He didn't argue, just laid down on the floor, back to the wall rifle within reach, one arm resting over his eyes. After a long silence, she whispered, "Why?" His voice came steady, almost lost in the crackle of fire. "Because no one deserves chains." The words hung in the air, heavy and clean. She waited. The silence invited truth. "I wore different chains," he said quietly, "but I know the weight. War. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the silence turned into something else. Not fear, not command, but room. Naira lay down on the bed, the quilt rough beneath her fingers. She watched the fire until her eyes blurred. Across the room, Elijah's breathing steadied, slow and even, a rhythm that matched the soft hiss of the stove. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the first night in a long time when neither waited for pain to wake them. In the hospital room, Marcus had stopped writing, his hand cramped from gripping the pen too tight. "Grandpa," he said, voice thick. She stayed. Elijah's eyes remained closed. A thin smile touched his lips. "Not right away." She was afraid. Afraid of me. Afraid of all white men. He paused. breath rattling. But that first night, that was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. Marcus leaned closer. What happened next? The old man's smile faded. Next came the hard part. Because Freedom Boy isn't something you buy once. It's something you fight for, every single day. His hand moved weakly toward Marcus. The boy took it, felt how cold the fingers were. They came for her, Elijah whispered. 3 times they came, and I had to make a choice. Between the law and what was right. Marcus squeezed his great-grandfather's hand. Tell me, I need to know. Outside the window, the Arizona sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The same sun that had witnessed everything 70 years ago. The same sun that never forgot. And Elijah Stone, 100 years old, with death sitting patient in the corner of the room, continued his story. Elijah's voice grew stronger, as if the telling itself was breathing life back into him. Marcus watched his great-grandfather's face, saw decades fall away as memory took hold. That first morning, Elijah said, I woke before dawn, old habit from the cavalry, your body never forgets. The words carried Marcus back through time. Morning came not with announcement, but with gradual light creeping across floorboards. Elijah opened his eyes to find Naira already awake, sitting upright on the bed, watching the door. Her hand gripped the blanket like a weapon. He sat up slowly, making his movements visible, predictable. Morning. She didn't respond, just watched. He stood, walked to the water jug, poured into a tin cup, set it on the table, then stepped back 3 paces, making space. She looked at the cup, at him, at the cup again. Finally rose and crossed the room, moving like someone walking through a river, each step fighting current. She drank standing, never turning her back to him. He busied himself at the stove, added wood, set the coffee pot on the iron top. The smell of brewing grounds filled the small space. Breakfast, he said. Beans again. And coffee. He didn't apologize for plain food. Plain food kept Bones from whispering too loud about hunger. They ate facing the stove. He finished first, but remained seated, letting the quiet turn from awkward to ordinary. When she laid the spoon down, he nodded toward the door. Come outside. She paused, then rose. The cabin's threshold was a small country to cross. Outside, the morning air bit at her feet through the thin wool socks. She flinched. Elijah noticed. He disappeared inside, returned with a pair of thicker socks, the kind that had outlived 3 winters and still had 1 more left in them. For now, he said. She looked at them like a puzzle, then slid them on. The wool pricked her skin. Her toes curled into heat that felt like permission. They stood in the yard. The land spread out in all directions. Yellow grass bowed by wind. The corral leaning with age but standing. Naira drew a breath so deep it surprised her. The air tasted of iron and juniper. She turned her face toward the light, then knelt and pressed her palm to the soil. Not a prayer anyone would recognize. Only a touch that said the earth still remembered her. Elijah pointed with his chin toward the barn. We start there. He didn't list rules, didn't say what she owed. He showed her where the feed was kept, how to scatter grain for the hens. 12 Rhode Island red chickens, each one named, though he'd never admit it. How to check the water trough for ice in winter, algae in summer. She watched his hands, not his mouth. When he lifted a log and his shoulder seized, she caught the flinch he tried to hide. Old wound, he said, as if that explained everything and nothing. She nodded. The nod wasn't pity. It was a marker on the map they were drawing between them. He handed her a small hatchet. Duluth make 3.5-pound head, hickory handle. Split that one. He meant a short log set upright on a stump. He stood close enough to correct a mistake, far enough to let the mistake happen without shame. Her first swing glanced off, bit the stump. She reset the log, moved her feet, planted them like he had, brought the blade down. The wood opened with a sharp report that seemed too loud for morning. She straightened. Something small in her shoulders lifted. Good, he said. Didn't smile until she looked away. They worked in that rhythm. Show, attempt, adjust. Until sweat warmed her under the shirt and the frost burned off the fence rails. She learned the weight of the hammer, the patience of wire, the way nails find the straight edge if your hand is steady. He learned the cadence of her silence, the one for concentration, the one for fear, the one for memory pressing its thumb to her throat. When the last rail was braced, he stepped back, considering the work. "Hold," he said, and passed her a length of wire to keep while he tied off the other end. Their hands missed, twice touched, once then found the wire, pulled it together. He didn't look at the touch, neither did she. The wire held. That was the point. Around mid-morning, a wagon creaked along the far road, throwing a small cloud of dust behind it. Naira's body stiffened, as if pulled by a string, eyes locked on the moving shape. Elijah stepped between her and the road, casual enough not to make it worse, deliberate enough to make it better. He rested a hand near his holster. Colt .45 single-action, 7.5-inch barrel, 6 rounds. He kept it loaded with 5 hammer on an empty chamber. Safe carry. The wagon rolled past without turning in. An older man with a hat pulled low, a milk can rattling in the back. The moment stretched, then snapped. "No one touches you here," Elijah said, not looking at her when he said it. A promise that wore plain clothes, and it fit him. They went back inside when the wind rose and the hens became loud with opinions. He boiled coffee more for warmth than taste. She watched the steam twist the way breath twists when you carry it too long. On the table lay the strip of cloth she had used to wipe her wrists. The skin was less angry now, though the grooves remained. She picked up the cloth and folded it into a narrow band. "May I?" she asked. The English arranged itself carefully, each word placed like stones across a creek. He nodded. She came near and wrapped his shoulder through the shirt. Not over the wound, but where the muscle strained. Her fingers worked with a care that refused to call itself tenderness. He held still, letting her do the work. When she tied the knot, he tested the lift of his arm, grunted once, not pain exactly, the admission of being human. "Better," he said. She stepped back. The air between them had the clean feel of a floor just swept. Days passed like that, each one building on the one before, small acts of trust stacked like cordwood. By the end of the second week, Naira laughed, just once, a small startled sound when one of the hens chased another in a furious circle over a grasshopper. The laugh made Elijah stop mid-swing with the axe. He looked at her. She caught him looking, and the laugh died, but something in her eyes stayed bright. That afternoon, a wagon approached. This one turned into the property. Elijah set down his tools. "Stay close to the cabin." Naira moved toward the door but didn't go inside. She had learned that running made her feel like prey. Standing made her feel like a person. The wagon stopped 20 feet from the porch. A woman climbed down, first, then a man. The woman was Chinese, mid-30s, with graying hair pulled back tight. She wore a simple dress mended at the elbows. The man beside her was older, maybe 40, with the lean build of someone who worked land for a living. "Elijah," the man called out. "Hope we're not intruding. Thomas, Sarah?" Elijah relaxed but didn't move his hand far from his side. "What brings you?" Thomas Chen gestured to the basket Sarah carried. "Heard what you did in town. Figured you could use some supplies. And maybe some friendly faces." Sarah approached slowly, eyes moving between Elijah and Naira. When she got close, she set the basket down and spoke directly to Naira. Her English carried an accent, but the words were clear. "I am Sarah. This is Thomas. We live 5 miles south." She pointed. "You are safe here. I know this." Naira studied Sarah's face, saw something there that made her shoulders drop half an inch. Recognition, not of person, but of experience. Sarah pulled back her sleeve slightly, showed a faint scar around her wrist. "I know rope," she said simply. Thomas stepped forward, addressing Elijah. "Town's talking, you know that. Let them talk. Elijah." Thomas's voice dropped. "Victor Grimshaw is asking questions. Says you stole his property." "She's not property." "I know that, you know that." Thomas glanced at Naira, then back. But Grimshaw has papers, says he owns the deed. Elijah's jaw tightened. What kind of papers? Legal ones, or legal-looking. He's filed with the territorial office. Thomas reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope. This came to the general store, addressed to you. Postmaster asked me to deliver it. Elijah took the envelope. Heavy paper, official seal. He didn't open it. Thank you for bringing it. Sarah had been talking quietly with Naira, using mostly gestures and simple words. She turned to Elijah. She can come stay with us, if trouble comes. Trouble's already here, Elijah said, but I appreciate the offer. After Thomas and Sarah left, Elijah sat at the table with the envelope in front of him. Naira stood near the stove watching. "What is—" she asked. He looked at her, then at the envelope. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper inside, read it once, read it again. His face went still in a way that scared her more than anger would have. "Says I have to appear in territorial court, Red Willow, 7 days from now." He kept reading. "Says I'm charged with theft of indentured labor. Says I owe Victor Grimshaw $50 or return the property." "Property," Naira repeated. The word tasted like ash. "You're not property." Elijah set the paper down. "You're not going back. Law says different. Law's wrong." She came closer, stood on the other side of the table. "You fight law, you lose everything. Already lost everything once." He met her eyes. "Before I met you, what I've got now, it's worth fighting for." That night after dark, after beans and coffee and silence, Naira couldn't sleep. She sat on the bed staring at nothing. Elijah lay on his bedroll by the door, eyes closed but not sleeping. "Elijah," he opened his eyes. "Tell me about war." He was quiet for a long time. Then he sat up, back against the wall. "What do you want to know? Why you have chains?" He understood. She meant the invisible ones, the kind that wrapped around your chest and squeezed. "5th Cavalry," he said. "Enlisted in 75. I was 22. Thought I was serving something noble." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We chased Apache raiders, chased them for 6 years, and then—" He stopped. She waited. "Then they gave us different orders, not to chase, to eliminate." The word sat heavy in the dark. "White Mountains, November 1881. A village, maybe 50 people, most of them women and children." Naira went very still. He couldn't see her face in the darkness, but he felt the change in the air. "The lieutenant, his name was Harwood. He said we had orders from Washington, no survivors, said they were hiding raiders." Elijah's voice went flat. "They weren't. They were just families, living, existing. You were there, not a question. I was there. You kill my people." "No." The word came out sharp. "I refused. I told Harwood I wouldn't do it. He had me arrested, court-martialed, discharged without honor." He paused. "But I didn't pull a trigger, and I didn't stop them either. I just stood there while they burned everything." Naira stood up, walked to the table. Her hand found the knife they'd used for dinner. She picked it up. Elijah didn't move. She came closer. The knife trembled in her hand. "You watch my family die." "I don't know if it was your family, but yes, I watched families die." "Why, you no tell me." "Because I'm a coward." His voice cracked. "I watched them die. I did nothing, and I've lived with that shame every day since." The knife stayed in her hand. Minutes passed. The fire popped. Wind moved against the cabin walls. Finally Naira spoke. "You refuse order. You lose everything. Rank, honor, home." "Yes. That not coward, that different kind of brave." She set the knife down. "You choose right thing, even when it cost everything. Doesn't change what happened." "No." She moved back toward the bed. "But it changed why you buy me, not charity. Debt. Yes, a debt I can never repay." She lay down, pulled the blanket up. "You save one. You no save all, but you save one." Her voice came quieter now. "That's something." Elijah sat in the dark, listening to her breathing even out. Sleep came for her slowly. For him, not at all. In the hospital room, Marcus had tears running down his face. "She forgave you," he whispered. Elijah's eyes stayed closed. "She understood. That's different from forgiveness. But it was enough. What happened in 7 days when you had to go to court?" The old man's hand tightened on Marcus's. "Court never happened, because 6 days later they came for her, not with papers, with guns." Marcus leaned forward. "Who? Grimshaw's men. 5 of them." Elijah's breathing became labored. "And that night, I had to choose. Between the law I swore to uphold when I was young and stupid, and the only thing that mattered." "What did you choose?" Elijah opened his eyes. They were bright, fierce, despite the century weighing on them. "I chose her. I chose freedom. And I chose to fight." The sun outside had moved lower. The room was filling with orange light, the same color as memory, the same color as fire. "Tell me," Marcus said. "Tell me about the fight." And Elijah Stone, 100 years old, with death patient in the corner and truth burning in his chest, told his great-grandson about the night everything changed, the night he stopped running from his past and started building a future. The night 5 men came to take what wasn't theirs and found out what happens when you push a guilty man too far. The night the cabin almost burned. The night Sarah and Thomas Chen proved what friendship looked like. The night Naira stopped being someone he saved and became someone who saved him right back. But that story would take time. And time was something Elijah Stone had very little of left. "Rest first, Grandpa," Marcus said, seeing how the telling had drained him. "I'm not going anywhere." Elijah nodded, closed his eyes. But his hand stayed wrapped around Marcus's, holding on. Because the story wasn't finished, not yet. And some stories need to be told all the way to the end, no matter how much it costs. Outside, the Arizona sun continued its ancient work of rising and setting, marking time the way it had for 100 years, for 1,000, for always. Patient, relentless, witnessing everything. And in that hospital room, with machines beeping their steady rhythm and flowers dying in their vase, an old man prepared to tell the hardest part of his story, the part about violence and choice, the part about what happens when law and justice stand on opposite sides, the part about the night everything burned. The nurse came in to check vitals. Marcus stepped into the hallway, bought coffee from a machine that dispensed something brown and bitter. When he returned, Elijah was awake, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that made the boy think his great-grandfather was seeing through it, into the past, into that night. "You ready?" Elijah asked. Marcus nodded, settled back into the chair. "I'm ready." "Then listen close, because this is the part that matters most, the part about what a man does when everything he believes gets tested. 6 days after the letter arrived, 6 days of waiting, 6 days of preparation." Elijah had spent those days teaching Naira things she needed to know. Not just how to shoot, though that was part of it, how to move in darkness, how to stay low when bullets fly, how to find cover, how to breathe through fear. He taught her the cabin's weak points, the back window that opened quiet if you knew the trick, the root cellar under the floor hidden beneath a rug, the canyon trail 1/2 mile north that led to the Chen Ranch. "If something happens to me," he said, on the 5th day, "you run. Don't look back. Sarah and Thomas will hide you." Naira was cleaning the Colt 45. She had learned to field strip it oil, reassemble it. Her hands moved with confidence now. "If something happened to you, I stay. I fight." "Naira, I run all my life, Elijah. I no run anymore." He wanted to argue, couldn't find the words, because he understood. Running was surviving, standing was living. And she had chosen. Thomas Chen had come by twice more, brought ammunition, brought news. Grimshaw had hired men, 5 of them, drifters from Tucson with reputations for violence. Word was they planned to come at night when the law was asleep and witnesses were scarce. "I can be here," Thomas offered. "Sarah too. We can help." "No," Elijah shook his head. You've got children. I won't put them at risk. We're already at risk. Men like Grimshaw, they don't stop with one target. Thomas gripped Elijah's shoulder. But I understand. Just know. If you need us, fire 3 shots. We'll come running. On the 6th night, Elijah and Naira ate dinner in silence. Beans again, the last of the salt pork, coffee so strong it could strip paint. They didn't talk about what might come. They had said everything that needed saying. After dark, Elijah checked his weapons. Winchester 73-15 rounds in the tube. The Colt at his hip. A shotgun double barrel loaded with buckshot propped by the back window. He had stacked feed sacks near the windows for cover. Not bulletproof, but better than nothing. Naira wore the canvas pants and shirt he had given her. Better for moving than a dress. Her hair was tied back. The Colt 45 looked too big in her hands, but she held it like she meant it. They sat in darkness, fire out, lamp out. Only moonlight through the windows, Elijah by the front, Naira by the back. Waiting. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning. 2. The horses in the corral shifted and snorted. Normal sounds, then they went quiet. Not normal. Elijah tensed. Naira looked at him across the dark cabin. He held up 5 fingers, 5 men, then pointed to his ears. Listen. The horses knew. Animals always knew. Something was moving out there that didn't belong. 3 in the morning. The dead hour. When the body wants sleep more than breath, when reflexes slow and attention drifts, the hour men pick for killing. The sound of horses, quiet. Walking, not running. Coming from the south, from town. 5 riders stopping just beyond the fence line. Elijah moved to the window, peered through a crack in the shutters, saw shapes in moonlight. 5 men dismounting. One of them held a torch not lit yet. Another carried rope. A third had a shotgun cradled casual in his arms. Not lawmen. The law didn't come at 3 in the morning with rope and torches. A voice called out, loud, practiced. Stone, we know you're in there. Federal warrant for your arrest. Come out peaceable. Elijah recognized the voice, not Grimshaw. Not the marshal, one of Grimshaw's ranch hands, a man named Cutter, known for bar fights and meanness. Federal warrant, Elijah muttered. They think I'm stupid. He moved to the door but didn't open it, raised his voice to Carrie. Show me the warrant. Slide it under the door. Laughter outside. Don't work that way, Stone. You come out, we'll show you all the paper you want. I don't think you've got paper. I think you've got rope and bad intentions. The laughter died. Last chance. Send the squaw out. Walk away. No one gets hurt. Elijah looked across the cabin at Naira. Even in darkness he could see her face. Set. Determined. She shook her head once. Definite. He turned back to the door. Not happening. Your funeral. The first shot came through the front window. Glass exploded inward. The bullet buried itself in the back wall 6 inches from where Naira crouched. She didn't flinch. Just raised the Colt, aimed at the muzzle flash outside, fired back. The roar in the confined space was deafening. A man screamed. Not a death scream. Pain. She had hit something. Good, Elijah said. Then the world became thunder. 5 men opened fire. Not aimed, just volume. Trying to fill the cabin with lead and fear. Bullets punched through wood. Shattered what glass remained. Kicked up splinters. The feed sacks absorbed some rounds. Others went clean through. Elijah dropped below the window, waited for the volley to pause. Men had to reload. In that pause he rose, shouldered the Winchester, picked his target, a shape moving toward the corral. Squeezed. The rifle kicked. The shape dropped. Another pause. Another opportunity. He worked the lever, fired again. Missed. The man dove behind a water trough. From the back window, Naira fired twice. Steady. Controlled. The way he had taught her. He heard a grunt, a curse. She was hitting them. Can't get a clean shot, one of the attackers yelled. Burn them out, another answered. Elijah's blood went cold. The torch. He had forgotten the torch. He moved to the side window, the one facing south, saw a man running toward the cabin torch, blazing, now arm cocked back to throw. Elijah aimed, led the target, fired. The man spun, dropped the torch. It landed in dirt, harmless. But the man wasn't dead, just wounded. He crawled back toward the fence, leaving a dark trail. "How many rounds?" Elijah called to Naira. 3 left. He had 7 in the Winchester, 2 shells in the shotgun, 5 in the Colt. Not enough if they rushed together. Another volley. These men had ammunition to spare. Grimshaw's money buying bullets. They didn't need to be accurate, just loud, just persistent, just patient. A bullet caught Elijah's left thigh, not a clean through and through. It gouged a channel shallow but bleeding. He gasped, dropped below the window, pressed his hand to it. Warm blood between fingers. "Elijah," Naira's voice carried fear for the first time. "I'm good." "Stay down." But he wasn't good. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was sapping strength with every heartbeat. He tied his bandana around it, pulled tight with his teeth. The bleeding slowed. Didn't stop. Outside, the men were regrouping. He could hear them talking, arguing. "We signed up for an easy job cutter, not a war." "Grimshaw's paying $50 each. You want to walk away from $50? Not worth dying for." "Then don't die. Wait them out. They can't have much ammunition left. When they're dry, we walk in and take her." Silence. Then agreement. The most dangerous kind of enemy. The patient kind. Elijah checked his pocket watch. 3:30. Dawn at 6. If they could hold until dawn, until people on the roads could see smoke and hear gunfire, these men would retreat. Lynching required darkness and secrecy. Daylight made witnesses. 2.5 hours. Might as well be 2.5 years. He reloaded the Winchester from his ammunition box. 14 rounds left total, counted them twice. 14 rounds to hold off 5 men for 2.5 hours. The mathematics of desperation. 4 o'clock came. 4:30. The men outside fired sporadically now, conserving ammunition too, or trying to draw return fire, make Elijah and Naira waste bullets. He didn't bite, just watched, waited. At 4:45 he smelled smoke, not gun smoke, wood smoke, old smoke, the wrong kind of smoke. He looked up. Through gaps in the roof boards he saw orange glow. They had climbed up, quiet as shadows, set fire to the shingles. Patient, smart, evil. "Naira, fire, roof." She looked up, saw it spreading. The dry timber catching fast. Within minutes the ceiling would drop. Within 10 minutes the whole structure would be engulfed. "We go out or we burn," she said. Elijah's mind raced. Out the front they faced guns. Out the back, same. The root cellar would buy minutes, but then they would suffocate or cook. The canyon trail was too far. They would be cut down in open ground. No good options, only degrees of bad. "We go out the back, fast, stay low, make for the corral. Horses give us cover." He grabbed the shotgun. "I go first. Draw their fire. You follow 3 seconds after. Understood?" "No, we go together." "Naira, together." Her eyes locked on his. "You teach me stand." Now we stand together. The roof groaned. A beam cracked. Embers fell like hellish snow. "All right." He moved to the back door. She stacked beside him. He could feel heat above. Hear flames consuming 70 years of wood and sweat and solitude. Everything he owned turning to ash in memory. On 3, low and fast. "Don't stop moving." She nodded. 1. He gripped the shotgun. 2. She thumbed back the hammer on the Colt. 3. He kicked the door open. The night air hit like cold water. He dove left, rolled, came up with the shotgun leveled, saw a shape fired. The blast lit the darkness. The shape flew backward. Naira came through behind him, rolled right. A muzzle flash. A bullet cracked past her head. She fired twice. The muzzle flash went dark. They scrambled toward the corral. Behind them, the cabin roared. Flames reached through the roof, punching holes in the night. Light everywhere now. Too much light. Nowhere to hide. Elijah reached the fence, dragged himself behind a post. His leg screamed. The bandana was soaked through. Naira slid in beside him, breathing hard, unhurt. 3 left, she said, meaning 3 rounds. He had the second barrel of the shotgun, 5 in the Colt. The Winchester still in the cabin lost to fire. 8 rounds total between them, 3 attackers still moving. The fire turned night into day. The cabin collapsed inward with a roar that sounded like rage. Sparks fountained into the sky. In that light, Elijah saw the 3 remaining men, saw them clear, saw their faces. One of them was Cutter. The other 2 were younger, scared now. This had stopped being easy money. "Cutter," Elijah shouted. "You tell Grimshaw he can have the land, he can have the horses, he can have everything, but the woman stays free. That's not negotiable." Cutter stood slowly, using his horse for cover. "Can't do that, Stone. We got a contract." "Contract's with a dead man if you don't ride out now. You're bleeding, Stone. You're low on ammunition, and there's 3 of us." Cutter's voice carried confidence again, smelling victory. "Just make it easy." That was when the rifle shot split the night from the north. Not Elijah's gun, not Naira's. A different caliber, higher pitch. The bullet kicked dirt 2 feet in front of Cutter's horse. The animal reared, screaming. Another shot, from a different angle, west. This one closer to one of the younger men. He dove flat. A 3rd shot. East, Elijah understood. Triangulation, 3 shooters. Surrounding the attackers, Thomas Chen's voice carried across the distance. "Next one takes your horse, Cutter. One after that takes your leg. One after that we stop being polite." Sarah's voice from another direction, accented but clear. "We see everything. We tell everyone. You want to hang, keep fighting." A 3rd voice, unfamiliar. "Federal marshal's been notified. Should be here by dawn. You boys want to explain corpses to him." Cutter looked around, counted odds. 3 against 5 had become 3 against 8. With witnesses, with the law coming. The mathematics had shifted. "This isn't over," he shouted. But he was already moving toward his horse. The 2 younger men didn't wait for permission. They ran. Wounded men forgotten, money forgotten, just gone disappearing into darkness faster than they had come. Elijah sagged against the fence post. The adrenaline draining left nothing but pain and exhaustion. Naira caught him before he fell. "Elijah, stay." "Staying," he managed. "Just need a minute." Thomas emerged from the darkness, rifle in hand. Sarah behind him. A 3rd figure, tall and lean, wearing a badge. Marshal Robert Dalton. The marshal looked at the burning cabin, at the wounded man by the water trough, at the blood trail leading to where another had crawled into the brush, at Elijah bleeding into Naira's arms. "Someone want to tell me what happened here." His voice was tired, the voice of a man who had seen too much and believed in too little. "Self-defense," Elijah said. 5 men attacked. I have witnesses." Dalton looked at Thomas. "That true? Saw it all, Marshal. They came to lynch. Stone defended his home." "His home." Dalton looked at the inferno. "Not much left to defend." "The land's still here," Elijah said. "The principal's still here. That's enough." Dalton sighed, pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Came out here to serve you this. Figured I'd do it proper, not at 3 in the morning with guns." He held it out. "Seems I'm too late." "What is it?" "Dismissal of charges. Federal judge in Tucson reviewed Grimshaw's papers. They're forgeries. The deed he claimed the bill of sale, all of it fabricated. Judge issued a warrant for Grimshaw's arrest 2 days ago." The words took a moment to penetrate. Elijah stared at the paper. "You're saying—" "I'm saying the woman was never legally owned. Not by Grimshaw. Not by anyone. The Territorial Indian Affairs Office has no record of her indenture. Never did." Dalton looked at Naira. "You're free, ma'am. Always were. I'm sorry for what you endured." Naira didn't move, didn't speak, just held Elijah tighter. "The men who attacked," Dalton continued, "I'll be issuing warrants. Attempted murder, arson, conspiracy. Grimshaw, too, for hiring them." "Good," Elijah said. Then the world tilted sideways and went gray at the edges. He woke on the ground with Sarah Chen pressing cloth to his leg and Thomas holding a canteen to his lips. Naira sat beside him, her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, making sure. "You stay," she whispered. "You stay with me." "Staying," he promised. Dawn came while they sat there. The cabin burned down to embers. Smoke rose straight up in still air, a pillar marking where something had ended and something else had begun. In the hospital room, Marcus was crying openly now. "You almost died." "Almost." Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. "But didn't. Your grandmother made sure." "What happened after? Did you rebuild?" "We rebuilt. Thomas and Sarah helped. Other neighbors too, once word spread about what Grimshaw had done. Took us 4 months to put up a new cabin, smaller than the first, but strong." He smiled. "Your grandmother chose where every nail went. Said if it was going to be her home, she wanted it built right." "Her home," Marcus repeated. "Her home. Our home." Elijah opened his eyes. "We married in 1887, not in a church. Churches didn't marry Apache women to white men in those days. But under the sky, with Thomas and Sarah as witnesses, that was enough. And Samuel, my great-grandfather, born in 1885, raised on that ranch, learned to work wood and metal, went to work in the mines when he was grown." Elijah's face clouded. "Died in a collapse. 1923. He was 38. Your grandmother never fully recovered from that. And Daniel, my grandfather, Samuel's son, born 1893, good man, strong like his grandmother. He raised you, father, after Samuel died, then enlisted when the war came. Normandy, June 6, 1944. Elijah's hand tightened on Marcus's. "He died so men like you could be free. Like I tried to keep your grandmother free. Freedom, boy. It's the only thing worth dying for." Marcus wiped his eyes. "And great-grandma Naira, when did she?" 1940. Tuberculosis. She was 57, still young, too young." Elijah's voice broke. "Before she died, she made me promise to tell the story, to write it down, so our children's children would know what freedom costs." He gestured weakly at the journal in Marcus's hands. "It's all in there, every word. I want you to have it, to keep it, to pass it on." "I will, Grandpa, I promise." Elijah's breathing had become shallow, labored. The nurse would be back soon. Maybe the doctor. Maybe the end. "One more thing," the old man said. "The land, the ranch. It's still there, still in the family. Your uncle manages it now, but it'll be yours someday. And when you stand on that soil, you remember. You remember what it took to keep it, what it meant." "I'll remember." "Good." Elijah closed his eyes. "Then I can rest. Finally, after 100 years, I can rest." Marcus leaned forward. "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, boy. Now go, live, be free. That's all I ever wanted, for all of us, to be free." The sun was setting outside the window. Orange and gold, the colors of fire, the colors of memory. Elijah Stone. 100 years old, let his breathing slow, let his heartbeat quiet. The man who had bought freedom for $6 silver and paid for it every day since was finally letting go. The weight of a century slipped away, like a coat taken off at the end of a long journey. He had told the story, kept the promise, passed the torch, and in the moment before the dark came for good, he thought he heard her voice. Naira, young again, calling to him in Apache words he had learned over 50 years of marriage, words that meant, "Come home." So he did. Finally, he went home. The machines stopped their rhythm first. Then came the silence, heavy and absolute, pressing down on the hospital room like a physical weight. Marcus sat frozen, his hand still wrapped around his great-grandfather's, feeling the warmth fade, degree by degree, life retreating into memory. The monitors showed flat lines, no heartbeat, no breath, no electrical spark of consciousness. Elijah Stone, born 1853, died 2024. 100 years, 5 months, and 11 days. A century of breathing, of remembering, of carrying weight. that most men would have collapsed under. Marcus couldn't move, couldn't speak. The journal lay open on his lap. Pages yellowed with age, ink faded, but still legible. 100 years of secrets committed to paper in careful, measured handwriting. The handwriting of a man who understood that words once written become permanent. Accountable. A nurse entered quietly, checked the monitors, though she already knew what they would say. She felt for a pulse that wouldn't be there, made notes on a clipboard, then looked at Marcus with practiced sympathy that was nonetheless genuine. "I'm so sorry, honey. He's gone." The words should have meant something, should have triggered tears or denial or some recognizable form of grief. But Marcus just sat there, staring at the face that had held so much history. The deep lines carved by a century of sun and sorrow. The scar from jaw to collarbone, faded now to a pale line but still visible, evidence that never fully disappeared. "He lasted longer than anyone expected," the nurse continued gently. 100 years, that's a real blessing. Not many people get that kind of time. Marcus nodded because it seemed like the thing to do. The nurse gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, maternal and brief, then left to begin the paperwork that follows death. The administrative machinery that reduces a life to forms and signatures and decisions about what to do with the body. Marcus sat alone with what had been Elijah Stone. Not Elijah anymore, just a body, an empty vessel that had once contained a vast ocean of experience and was now simply matter cooling toward room temperature. He looked at the face, peaceful now in a way it never had been in life. Even at 100, even barely conscious, Elijah had carried tension in his jaw and the corners of his eyes. The permanent posture of someone waiting for the next threat, the next loss, the next price to be paid. Now that tension was gone, released. Whatever debt Elijah had felt he owed death had apparently paid it in full. Marcus thought about the young man who had stood at that auction block 70 years ago, 30 years old, scarred, broke, guilty, looking at a woman in chains and seeing his own failure reflected back at him, seeing white mountains, seeing the families he hadn't saved, seeing one chance, maybe the only chance he would ever get to do something right. $6 silver, 2 weeks' wages, the price of a used saddle, or 3 days of hired labor. The price he paid to buy freedom for a stranger who would become his wife, the mother of his children, the center of his world for 53 years. Marcus thought about Naira. Born 1859, died 1940, 81 years, 53 of them spent with Elijah, the woman whose name meant bright as sun, who had survived the massacre at White Mountains, who had been sold and resold like livestock, who had stood on that platform with rope cutting into her wrists and made the choice not to flinch, not to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break, who had impossibly forgiven the man who had been there when her family died, who had seen past his uniform to the person underneath, who had understood that refusing an order, losing everything, living with shame for decades, these things were their own kind of courage. He thought about Samuel, born 1885, died 1923 in a mine collapse, 38 years old, Elijah and Naira's only child, though they had tried for more. A son who had inherited his mother's quiet strength and his father's sense of justice, who had worked himself to death in copper mines to provide for his family, who had left behind a wife and a 10-year-old son named Daniel Stone. Born 1893, died June 6, 1944, on a beach in Normandy, 51 years old. Marcus's grandfather, though they had never met. Daniel had died 2 months before Robert was born, jumping on a grenade to save 5 men in his unit. The medal came with a flag and a letter from the president. The family got a grave in France and a hole that never quite filled in. And now Marcus, 18 years old, sitting in a hospital room with a dead man and a journal, and a weight of expectation he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The blood that ran through his veins was Apache and white slave and soldier, victim and savior, all of it mixed together over 4 generations into something new, something that carried all those histories without being defined by any single one of them. His phone rang, shattering the heavy silence. "Uncle Robert." Marcus answered, his voice coming out rougher than expected. "Marcus," the hospital called. "Is it true?" "Yeah." Marcus had to clear his throat. "He's gone. Passed about 10 minutes ago." A long exhale on the other end. Uncle Robert, 63 years old, tough as weathered leather, trying to process the impossible fact that his grandfather, the man who had seemed eternal, was actually mortal after all. 100 years, Robert said finally. Hell of a run. Yeah. You were with him at the end. I was with him. He told me everything, Uncle Robert. The whole story. About how he met great-grandma, about the auction, about White Mountains, about the night the cabin burned, all of it. Silence on the line. Marcus could hear breathing careful and controlled. Then, he never told me that story. Not the whole thing. I'd ask him about great-grandma, about how they met, and he'd give me pieces. Little bits. Said she'd been mistreated. Said he bought her freedom. Said there was trouble after, but they survived. A pause. Never mentioned he was at White Mountains. Never said he almost died in that fire. He was ashamed, Marcus said. Even though he refused the order, even though he tried to stop it, even though he lost everything because he wouldn't participate. He still felt like he didn't do enough. Carried that his whole life. Jesus, Robert's voice was thick now. 100 years of that. 100 years of carrying guilt for something he tried to stop. He said great-grandma forgave him. That's what mattered. She would have. Bev, she was like that. Robert cleared his throat, pulling himself together. Listen, we need to handle arrangements. Funeral. Family notifications. Can you stay in town a few days? I can stay as long as you need. They talked logistics. The funeral home. The cemetery plot next to Naira that had been waiting 14 years. The obituary. Who to call, who to invite, what to say about a life that had spanned 3 centuries, if you counted the one he was born in, the one he lived most of in, and the one he died in. When Marcus hung up, the room felt even quieter. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting so long, walked to the window, and looked out at Arizona stretching away in all directions. November afternoon sun painting everything gold and orange, the colors of autumn, of ending, of fire. He turned back to the bed, to Elijah. He crossed the room, leaned down, kissed that cold forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me with this. I won't let you down." Then he picked up the journal, held it against his chest like a shield, and walked out of that hospital room carrying a story and a promise and a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. 3 days later, Marcus stood in a cemetery outside Red Willow, watching Elijah Stone's coffin lower into Arizona earth. 3 days later, Marcus stood in a cemetery outside Red Willow, watching Elijah Stone's coffin lower into Arizona earth. The sky was the same impossible blue it had been in 1883. The wind carried the same dust. The land remembered, even if most people had forgotten. The cemetery was old, established 1876, when Red Willow was still more dream than town. Gravestones leaned at angles weathered by decades of wind and sun. Some names were still legible. Others had been scoured away by time, leaving only the knowledge that someone had been buried there, someone who had mattered to someone else, even if the details were lost. There were maybe 30 people at the funeral. Not a lot for a man who had lived 100 years, but Elijah had outlived most of the people who had known him. His friends, his neighbors, even his enemies, all of them dust decades ago. Uncle Robert stood at the front, with his family, Marcus beside him. A handful of distant cousins whose connection to Elijah was genealogical more than personal. A few old-timers from town who remembered Elijah from back when could mean the 1960s or 70s, still decades after the events that had defined him. A representative from the Veterans Affairs Office stood in the back, uncomfortable in his suit there, because a 100-year-old veteran made good press even in death. The VA had sent flowers. A flag would be presented to the family, ceremonies and symbols that meant something to someone, though Marcus wasn't sure who. The preacher was young, maybe 30, which meant he had never met Elijah, never heard his voice, never felt that weight of quiet judgment when Elijah looked at you and seemed to see straight through to your spine. He said words about long life and faithful service and eternal rest. Generic words that could have applied to anyone, pulled from the standard funeral script with maybe a few details swapped in. 100 years of living reduced to 15 minutes of platitudes. Marcus barely heard it. He was looking at the grave being dug beside where the coffin would rest. At the headstone already there waiting 70 years for this moment. Naira Stone, born 1859, died 1940. The dates carved in granite. Below them, one line of text. She taught us what freedom means. Elijah had chosen those words himself back in 1940 when the world was at war and he was 87 years old and suddenly alone after 53 years of partnership. Those words were what he wanted people to remember about her. Not that she had been Apache, not that she had been a slave, not even that she had been his wife. That she had taught them about freedom, the real kind, the kind that costs everything and demands more. Elijah's headstone would match hers, same granite, same simple design. His would read, "He paid the price." Robert had ordered it 3 days ago using words from the journal from one of the entries Elijah had written in 1925 after Samuel died. "I paid the price for her freedom with $6, but the real price, the one that keeps getting paid, is measured in choice. Every day choosing to stand when sitting would be easier. Every day choosing to protect when abandoning would be safer. That price never stops coming due. And I'd pay it again, 1,000 times, 10,000. The coffin settled into the earth. The preacher said the final words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the great equalizer finally claiming its due. People came to Marcus one by one after, shook his hand, hugged him, said sorry for your loss and he was a good man and let me know if you need anything. The things people say when death makes them uncomfortable and they want permission to leave. Most of them drifted away quickly back to lives that would continue without pause or acknowledgement that someone extraordinary had just been subtracted from the world. Uncle Robert stayed. He stood beside Marcus as the cemetery workers began filling in the grave, shoveling Arizona dirt onto the coffin with rhythmic efficiency. The sound of it hitting wood was hollow and final. "Walk with me," Robert said when the hole was half filled. They left the cemetery, walked down a dirt road that curved through scrub and rock. November air was cool but not cold. Good weather for thinking, for processing. Neither spoke for several minutes, just walked boots crunching on packed earth vultures circling lazy overhead. Finally, Robert said, "Your great-grandfather never told me the whole story. Told me pieces over the years, little bits here and there. Said great-grandma Naira had been mistreated before he met her. Said he bought her freedom and there was trouble after, but they survived it together." He kicked at a rock. Never mentioned the auction. Never said he was at White Mountains. Never told me about the fire or almost dying or any of it. He was ashamed. Marcus repeated what he had said on the phone. Even after 100 years, even after great-grandma forgave him, he couldn't forgive himself. That sounds like him. Robert smiled sad and fond. He was a hard man to know, quiet. Kept things locked up so tight you'd think he'd swallowed the key. But underneath all that silence, underneath all that guilt, he was good. The kind of good that most people don't even try for because it costs too much. They walked further. The road became a trail narrower, less maintained. The trail led to a gate, wood posts, and wire fence weathered gray by decades of sun but still standing. Beyond it, land stretched out in rolling hills covered in yellow grass and scattered juniper. A ranch house sat in the distance, modern construction, probably built in the 1950s or 60s, but positioned on foundations that were much older. "This is it," Robert said, stopping at the gate. "Stone Ranch, 320 acres. Used to be bigger. 800 acres when Grandpa Elijah first homesteaded it in 1883. But pieces got sold off over the years. Hard times, bad harvests, medical bills, estate taxes, the usual things that shrink family land. He opened the gate, gestured Marcus through. But this core piece, these 320 acres, this is what he and great-grandma built everything on. Marcus stepped through onto stone land. His land, in a way, though he'd never thought of it like that before. Blood claim. Inheritance measured in soil and struggle. Where was the first cabin? He asked. The one that burned, Robert pointed north up a gentle rise. Top of that slope. Foundation still there if you know where to look. Come on. They climbed the slope, Robert moving with the easy confidence of someone who had walked this ground his entire life. Marcus followed, breathing hard by the time they reached the top. Not much of a hill, but his city lungs weren't used to elevation or exertion. At the crest, barely visible under decades of overgrowth and erosion, Marcus saw it. Stones arranged in a rough rectangle. Fragments of charred wood, blackened by fire that had burned 141 years ago but somehow hadn't fully decayed. The ghost of a building, the scar of a night when everything almost ended. Robert knelt, brushed dirt and grass away from one section of stone. Foundation. Grandpa Elijah built this himself, cut the stones from the canyon 3 miles east, hauled them here on a wagon he built from scrap. Took him 4 months just to get the foundation level. Marcus knelt beside him, touched the stones. They were still here, still solid, still bearing witness. After it burned, Robert continued, after that night when Grimshaw's men tried to kill them, they rebuilt. But not here. Couldn't bring themselves to build on the same spot where they'd almost died. So they moved it 30 yards south, closer to the spring. He pointed. That second cabin stood until 1955. I was 5 years old when it finally came down, too old and damaged to save. We replaced it with the current house. Do you remember great-grandma Naira? Marcus asked. Robert smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. Little bit. I was 14 when she died in 1940. Old enough to remember, not old enough to really know her. He sat back on his heels. She was quiet, like Grandpa Elijah, but different kind of quiet. His quiet was holding things in, keeping pain and guilt locked behind walls. Her quiet was more like stillness, like she'd learned how to be absolutely present in each moment because she knew how fast moments could be taken away. He pulled up a blade of grass, twisted it between his fingers. She used to give me hard candy, peppermints, and she'd speak to me in Apache sometimes. I didn't understand a word, but I loved the sound of it. Musical, rhythmic, like the language itself was telling a story even when the words were just about checking on the chickens or commenting on the weather. Did Grandpa Elijah understand Apache? Some. He learned over the years. Said it was important learning her language. Said too much had already been taken from her people. He wasn't going to let her language die if he could help it. Robert stood, brushed dirt from his jeans. They spoke it together sometimes. Private conversations I wasn't meant to understand. Looking back, I think it was how they maintained space that was just theirs. In a house that got pretty crowded sometimes with family and ranch hands and neighbors, they had this language that belonged only to them. They sat on the old foundation stones. The sun moved across the sky, tracking west, the way it had for billions of years, indifferent to human drama. Marcus opened the journal, found a passage he'd marked, read it aloud. June 7th, 1923. Samuel is dead. Cave-in at the mine. They brought his body home yesterday. Naira hasn't spoken since. Just sits by the window looking at the mountains. I don't know how to help her. I don't know how to help myself. We survived so much. Slavery, fire, men with guns and worse intentions. We survived all of that just to lose our son to rock and darkness and bad luck. What was the point? What did all that surviving buy us if it ends like this? Marcus's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, kept reading. Naira spoke today. First words in a week. She said, Samuel had 38 years, more than my mother, more than my brothers, more than most of my people. He had a good life because we fought for it. That's the point. Then she went back to the window. But I think she's right. I think that's all we can do. Fight for whatever years we get. Make them good years. Leave something behind that matters. Samuel mattered. His son Daniel matters. The fight matters. That has to be enough. Robert was crying, now 63 years old, and, weathered by decades of sun and labor, crying like a child. "My father," he said, voice thick. "Daniel. He died 2 months before I was born. Normandy. June 6, 1944. 21 years after Samuel." Grandma Naira got the telegram about Daniel's death on June 7th, exactly 21 years to the day after Samuel died. She lasted another month after that, then the tuberculosis just took her. Like she'd been holding on until she knew Daniel was gone, and then there was no reason to keep fighting. Marcus closed the journal carefully. Grandpa Elijah lived 53 more years after she died. 53 years alone. Well, not completely alone. He had family around. But alone in the way that matters. The person who knew him, really knew him, was gone. Robert wiped his eyes. "You want to know something? For 53 years, every single day, Grandpa Elijah walked up here to this foundation. Every day. Morning usually before the sun got too hot. He'd sit right where you're sitting and he'd talk to her. Out loud. Telling her about his day, about the family, about the world. I followed him once when I was maybe 8 years old, hid behind that juniper and listened. He was telling her about me, about how I'd learned to rope a calf that week and how proud she would have been. And then he just sat there for an hour in silence, just sitting, being with her in whatever way he could. They stayed there on the foundation as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Marcus kept reading entries from the journal. Robert listened, sometimes commenting, sometimes just crying. The story of Elijah and Naira unfolded again, spoken in the place where so much of it had happened. When Marcus reached the final entry, dated 2 weeks before Elijah's death, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm 100 years old. I've outlived everyone. Outlived my wife by 53 years. Outlived my son by 71. Outlived my grandson by 60. The only one left who carries the blood is young Marcus, 18 years old, good kid, smart, kind. He's been coming to visit me in the hospital. I think it's time to tell him. Time to pass the weight along. Not because I want to burden him, but because some stories need to live beyond the people who live them. Some debts pass down through blood. Some promises outlive the men who make them. Marcus is strong enough to carry this. I see it in him. Naira's strength, my stubbornness, Samuel's sense of justice, Daniel's courage, all of it mixed together in one 18-year-old kid who doesn't even know yet what he's capable of. But I know. And when I tell him the story, when I make him promise to keep it alive, he'll know too. That's my last job, my last price to pay, making sure the story survives, making sure people remember what freedom costs, what it's worth, why it matters. Then I can rest, finally. After 100 years of carrying this weight, I can set it down and let someone else carry it forward. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire, like memory, like blood. Robert stood, offered Marcus a hand, pulled him to his feet. "So what now?" Robert asked. "You've got this story, this journal. What are you going to do with it?" Marcus looked at the land stretching away in all directions. Stone land, his land, land that had been bought with 6 silver dollars and defended with blood and maintained through a century of back-breaking labor and stubborn refusal to give up. "I'm going to tell it," he said. "The way Grandpa Elijah wanted. I'm going to write it properly. Get it published. Make sure people know. That's a big task for an 18-year-old. I know, but he trusted me with it, and I made a promise." Marcus touched the journal. "Besides, this isn't just our family story. It's bigger than that. It's about what happens when you choose right over easy, when you choose mercy over revenge, when you choose to see people as human no matter what the law says they are. That story needs telling, especially now." Robert nodded slowly. "You're right, and you know what I'll help. I've got stories too. Things Grandpa told me over the years, details that might not be in that journal. We'll do it together. Make sure we get it right." They walked back down the slope as darkness gathered. The ranch house below showed lights now warm and yellow against the deepening blue of evening. Robert's wife Linda was cooking dinner. The smell of it carried on the wind, mixing with the scent of juniper and dust. "Stay for supper," Robert said. "Stay the week if you want. Meet the family properly. See what Grandpa and Great-Grandma built with their 140 years. Marcus stayed. He met Robert's wife Linda, who hugged him fiercely and said things about family and legacy that made him feel like he belonged. Met their 3 children, his second cousins, young adults now with jobs and mortgages and complicated lives. They ate pot roast and potatoes and bread that Linda had baked that morning. They told stories about Elijah, about Naira, about Samuel and Daniel, and all the people who had carried the name Stone through 5 generations of American history. Robert's youngest daughter, Emma, was 26, teaching history at a high school in Phoenix. When she heard about the journal, her whole face lit up with the particular excitement of someone who loves stories and understands their power. "Can I read it?" she asked, trying to contain her enthusiasm and failing. "Please, I teach a unit on territorial Arizona. A first-hand account like this, especially one involving the treatment of Apache people and the Underground Railroad-type rescue, it's incredible. My students would learn so much." Marcus looked at the journal, felt protective of it. This was Elijah's voice, Elijah's pain, Elijah's truth. Not something to be passed around casually, but then he remembered. The whole point was to share it, to teach it, to make sure people knew. "You can read it," he said carefully, "but you have to treat it like the treasure it is, and if you use it for teaching, you tell the whole story, not just the parts that fit a narrative, the complicated parts too, the parts that make people uncomfortable." Emma nodded seriously. "I promise. I'll guard it with my life." She took the journal with the reverence it deserved, disappeared into a bedroom to start reading. The others continued talking, but Marcus found himself drifting, exhausted by emotion and the weight of the last few days. Later that night, he lay in the guest room of Robert's house, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Through the window, he could see stars, more stars than ever showed in Phoenix, billions of them scattered across black infinity. The same stars Elijah and Naira had seen, the same configurations, the same ancient light. He thought about the story, about what to do with it, how to honor it properly. Writing it would take time, years probably. He'd have to learn the craft, research the historical context, interview anyone still alive who had known Elijah, visit archives, dig through old newspapers, verify dates and details. It would consume him, change the entire trajectory of his life. He'd been planning to study engineering, had scholarships lined up, a future mapped out that was practical and stable and safe. But now there was this, a promise made to a dying man, a story that demanded telling, a debt that required payment. Could he walk away from his plans? Could he spend years, maybe the rest of his life, chasing the ghost of a great-great-grandfather he'd barely known? As he lay there wrestling with the decision, he felt something shift inside him, a settling, a certainty that rose from somewhere deeper than logic. This was what he was meant to do. Not engineering, not the safe path, this. Telling Elijah and Naira's story. Making sure people understood what they had lived through, what they had built, what they had meant. The decision made, he felt lighter. He would do it, whatever it took, however long it required. He would learn to write properly, would dedicate himself to the craft, would treat this story with the respect and care it deserved. And maybe if he did it right, someone would read it and understand, would see themselves in Elijah's guilt or Naira's strength, would find courage to do the hard, right thing instead of the easy, wrong thing. That's what stories were for, not just entertainment, not just history, but transformation, inspiration. The passing down of wisdom earned through pain. He fell asleep with that thought and dreamed of fire and horses and a woman standing barefoot on an auction block waiting for someone to see her as human, dreamed of a man with a scar and $6 silver and a burden of guilt he would carry for 70 years. Dreamed of them together building something from nothing, turning trauma into love, choosing mercy over hate every single day for 53 years. The next morning, Marcus woke early before the sun, dressed quietly and slipped out of the house while the family still slept. Walked up to the old foundation again, drawn by something he couldn't name. Stood there as the sun rose, painting the world in colors that defied description. Colors that existed for maybe 10 minutes at dawn and then disappeared into the harsh light of day. Sacred colors, the colors of beginning. He thought about Elijah dying. Thought about Naira dying 53 years before him. Thought about Samuel crushed by rock. Thought about Daniel jumping on a grenade. Thought about all the ways people die and all the ways they live on. And he made a promise. Out loud. To the wind and the earth and the ghosts who might be listening. I'll tell it true. Every word, every moment. The ugly parts and the beautiful parts. I'll make sure people know what you did, what it cost, what it meant. I'll spend my life on this if that's what it takes. Because you trusted me, and because some promises are worth keeping, no matter what they cost. The wind answered him, moving through the grass, creating patterns that looked almost like writing, almost like approval. And Marcus knew deep in the place where certainty lives beyond doubt that he would keep this promise, would honor the trust Elijah had placed in him, would make sure that 100 years from now people would still know about the man who bought freedom with $6 silver and the woman who taught him what freedom really meant. He pulled out his phone, opened a note app, and began to type. Not the full story yet, just notes, impressions, the beginning of what would eventually become a book. Red Willow, Arizona Territory. Autumn 1883. The auction block stood in the town square like a gallows. Around it men gathered with the casual cruelty of those who had learned to see people as livestock. The words flowed. The story lived. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go, when they've finally paid every debt and kept every promise, an old soldier and the woman he had loved for 70 years smiled and let go of the weight they'd been carrying. The story was being told. The promise was being kept. The torch was being passed. And in the end, that was all they had ever asked for, all anyone could ask for, to be remembered, to be understood, to have mattered. Elijah Stone and Naira had mattered. For 140 years they had mattered. And now, through Marcus, through the words he would spend his life crafting, they would continue to matter, would continue to teach, would continue to remind people what freedom costs and why it's worth every penny of that terrible price. The sun climbed higher, the day began, and Marcus Stone, 18 years old, standing on ground his ancestors had defended with blood and tears and stubborn refusal to give up, started the work that would define the rest of his life, the work of remembering, the work of honoring, the work of keeping promises to the dead by telling their truth to the living. It was holy work, hard work, the kind of work that breaks some people. But Marcus didn't break. He had Naira's strength in his blood, Elijah's stubbornness, Samuel's sense of justice, Daniel's courage. He had enough. He would be enough. The story would be told. And in the telling, perhaps others would find the courage to tell their own stories, to speak their own truths, to remember that freedom isn't free, but it's always, always worth the cost. 5 years passed like water through cupped hands, fast but measured, leaving marks. Marcus was 23 now, sitting in a small apartment in Tucson, with 3 years of college behind him, and a manuscript spread across every available surface. Pages everywhere, notes pinned to walls, timeline charts covering the kitchenette, photographs, some original, most copies from archives, creating a visual map of lives lived long before he was born. His degree was in history now, not engineering. That decision made in a guest room 5 years ago had shaped everything that came after. His parents had been confused at first, then worried, then eventually accepting when they saw the fire in him, the sense of purpose that most 23-year-olds spent years searching for and never found. The manuscript was nearly finished. 400 pages, 80,000 words. The story of Elijah and Naira, researched and written and rewritten until every sentence felt true, every detail verified as much as the historical record allowed. He had spent those 5 years becoming the kind of writer the story deserved. Taking classes, reading everything. Learning from authors who understood that historical fiction required equal parts imagination and integrity. Writing draft after draft, each one getting closer to capturing the voices he heard in his head, the people he had come to know through journals and letters and family stories. The journal itself sat on his desk, protected now in an archival box that regulated humidity and blocked UV light. He had learned about preservation, about how paper yellows and ink fades and leather cracks, about how easily history disappears if you don't fight to keep it. He had also learned how much there was to know. The journal entries covered 70 years, but they were sporadic. Some years had dozens of entries. Others had only 1 or 2. Whole stretches of time existed in the spaces between words in the silence where Elijah either had nothing to say or couldn't bear to say it. So Marcus had filled those gaps with research. He had read everything he could find about Arizona Territory in the 1880s, about the treatment of Apache people, about homestead law and territorial courts and the price of cattle and coffee and nails, about what life actually looked like for people trying to build something in a place that seemed designed to break them. He had visited Red Willow a dozen times, walking the streets that Elijah had walked, standing where the auction block had been, though it was long gone now, replaced by a parking lot and a convenience store that sold lottery tickets and energy drinks. He had gone to the Territorial Archives in Phoenix, spent weeks reading through old newspapers on microfilm until his eyes burned. Found mentions of Elijah in court records. Found the warrant issued for Victor Grimshaw's arrest in November 1883, though Grimshaw himself had disappeared before Marshal Dalton could serve it. Fled to Mexico, rumor said. Died there of yellow fever in 1886. Justice delayed, but delivered. He had tracked down descendants of Thomas and Sarah Chen, found a grandson living in Scottsdale who remembered stories about his grandparents helping a man named Stone during some kind of trouble. The details were fuzzy after 80 years of oral tradition, but the core remained. Good people helping good people. Standing up when standing up mattered. He had even found military records for Elijah Stone, 5th Cavalry enlisted, 1875, court-martialed 1881 for refusing orders. The official record was sparse and bureaucratic, but between the lines, Marcus could read shame and politics and the military's desire to forget embarrassing incidents. The court-martial documents mentioned White Mountains, listed the date. November 14, 1881, 47 Apache killed, no military casualties. Orders came from Territorial Command approved by Washington, Lieutenant James Harwood commanding. Private. Elijah Stone refusing direct orders, charged with insubordination and cowardice in the face of the enemy. Cowardice. That word in official script, stamped and filed and preserved for anyone who cared to look. The military calling courage by the wrong name, because courage that questions authority is dangerous to systems built on obedience. Marcus had found Naira too, or traces of her. Apache oral historians had records of the White Mountains massacre. Lists of the dead kept by survivors passed down through generations because the government records didn't care enough to record names. Naira's family was there, her mother, her father, 2 younger brothers. All dead on the same day Elijah refused to participate in killing them. The coincidence of it, the terrible symmetry, had struck Marcus hard when he discovered it. Elijah and Naira, connected by violence before they ever met, connected by the worst day of both their lives. And then 2 years later, finding each other in Red Willow, building something beautiful from that shared trauma, refusing to let horror be the final word. His phone rang. Emma, Robert's daughter, the history teacher who had read the journal 5 years ago and become Marcus's closest collaborator in this project. "Tell me you're done," she said without preamble. "Tell me I can finally read the finished manuscript." Marcus looked at the pages covering every surface. "Almost. Maybe another week for final revisions." "You said that last month. Last month I meant it less." He rubbed his eyes, tired from too many late nights and too much coffee. "I'm terrified, Emma. What if it's not good enough? What if I mess up their story?" "You won't. You've lived with them for 5 years. You know them better than most people know their living relatives." Her voice softened. "Marcus, you've done the work. You've honored them. Now you need to let it go. Let other people read it. Let the story do what it's meant to do. What if no one wants to publish it? Then we publish it ourselves. But I think someone will want it. It's a good story. More than good. It's important." A pause. "Have you been back to the ranch lately?" "Not in a few months." "Why, Uncle Robert wants to see you. Says he has something to show you, something he found in the attic." Marcus felt a spike of curiosity. "What kind of something?" "He wouldn't tell me. Said you need to see it yourself. Can you drive out this weekend? I'll be there Saturday." Saturday morning found Marcus driving through desert that looked the same as it had 140 years ago. Same sky, same rocks, same defiant insistence on existing in a place where existence seemed impossible. He had come to love this landscape over the past 5 years, had learned to see beauty in its harshness, strength in its refusal to apologize for being difficult. The ranch appeared in the distance, familiar now as his own reflection. He had spent enough time here that it felt like home, or at least like the idea of home. The place his roots grew, even if he didn't live here. Uncle Robert was waiting on the porch, 68 years old now, moving a little slower than 5 years ago, but still strong, still present. Beside him sat a wooden crate, old and battered with writing burned into the side. E.S., 1883. Marcus's heart jumped. "Is that what I think it is? Found it in the attic last week. Been up there probably 70 years. Your great-grandfather must have put it there before he moved to the care facility." Robert patted the crate. "Hasn't been opened since near as I can tell. Thought you should be here when we look inside." They carried the crate into the house. Linda appeared with a crowbar and bottled water, and the understanding that whatever was about to happen was significant. Emma pulled up 10 minutes later, must have broken speed limits to get there so fast. The 4 of them gathered around the kitchen table. Robert worked the crowbar carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. The nails gave reluctantly, squealing their protest after decades of holding firm. The lid came free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them from dust and time, were pieces of a life. Robert lifted out the first item. A photograph, sepia-toned, mounted on cardboard. A woman and a man standing in front of a wooden cabin. The man was maybe 40, wearing work clothes, one hand resting on a fence post. The woman beside him was younger, mid-30s, wearing a simple dress, her long dark hair braided. Both of them looked directly at the camera with expressions that were serious but not unhappy. The kind of seriousness that came from understanding that photographs were expensive and rare and needed to be treated accordingly. On the back, in handwriting, Marcus recognized from the journal Naira and I, 1893, 10 years married. Emma made a sound, half gasp, half sob. "That's them. That's actually them." Marcus took the photograph with trembling hands. After 5 years of imagining their faces, constructing them from descriptions and guesses, here they were. Real. Actual. Looking back at him across 130 years. Naira was beautiful. Not in the conventional way that photographs usually captured, but in the way that strength becomes beauty when you know how to see it. High cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to look through the camera into some middle-distance mouth set in a line that suggested she smiled rarely, but meant it when she did. Elijah beside her looked exactly like Marcus had imagined. the scar visible even in the photograph running from jaw to collarbone, broad shoulders, work-worn hands, eyes that carried weight. But standing next to Naira, he looked lighter somehow. Like her presence reduced his burden just by existing. There were more photographs, Elijah and Naira, with a boy maybe 10 years old. Samuel, the resemblance to his mother unmistakable. Another of Samuel as a young man standing with a woman. His wife Marcus assumed, Sarah, who had died with him in the mine collapse. One of a teenager in a military uniform looking impossibly young and serious. Daniel, Marcus's grandfather, taken probably just before he shipped out to France, before Normandy, before the grenade. Robert lifted out letters tied with string, dozens of them. Envelopes addressed to Elijah and Naira, Stone Ranch, Red Willow, Arizona Territory. Later ones just Arizona after statehood in 1912. These are from Samuel, Robert said, reading the return addresses, when he was working at different mines around the territory, and these are from Daniel from training camp in France. Emma was crying openly now, carefully untying the string around Daniel's letters. "Can I read them?" "That's why we're here," Robert said. "Marcus needs to see all of this, for the book." Marcus felt overwhelmed. 5 years of research, of imagination, of trying to construct truth from fragments, and now here was more truth than he knew what to do with. Evidence, proof, voices from the past speaking directly to the present. He spent the rest of the day reading letters and studying photographs, learning things the journal had never mentioned. Small details that made everything more real. Samuel writing to his parents about his work, about how hard the mines were, but how the pay was good, how he was saving money to buy more land. Telling them about Sarah, the woman he'd met, asking their blessing to marry her. Later letters full of mundane domestic details that became precious because they were all that remained. Complaints about weather, reports on the garden, news about neighbors. The last letter from Samuel was dated a week before he died, talking about Christmas plans, saying he'd be home soon, looking forward to seeing them. No premonition, no sense of ending. Just normal life right up until it stopped. Daniel's letters were harder to read. A 20-year-old trying to sound brave while describing things no 20-year-old should have to see. Beaches filled with bodies, friends dying, cold and fear, and the constant noise of artillery. One letter dated May 30th, 1944, a week before D-Day. Though Daniel couldn't say that, couldn't tell them what was coming, I think about the ranch a lot. About sitting on the porch watching the sun go down. About the smell of Grandma's bread baking. About Grandpa's stories, the way he'd sit quiet for long stretches and then say something so true you'd carry it with you forever. If I don't make it back, tell him I understood. Tell him I knew what he was teaching me all those years. About standing up, about doing right, even when it costs everything. About how freedom isn't free, but it's worth the price. Tell him I tried to live that way. Tell him I hope I made him proud. Marcus had to stop reading, had to walk outside and stand in the Arizona sun and breathe until the tightness in his chest eased. Robert followed him out, said nothing, just stood beside him in that companionable silence that ran in the family. "He never got that message," Marcus said finally. "Grandpa Elijah, Daniel was killed before this letter even arrived." "No," Robert said. "But he knew anyway. That's what makes it tragic and beautiful at the same time. He knew he'd taught Daniel something that mattered, knew Daniel would use it when the time came, and Daniel did. He jumped on that grenade, saved 5 men, lived what Grandpa Elijah had taught him about sacrifice." They stood there watching vultures circle, watching clouds build over distant mountains, watching the land do what it always did, persist, endure, outlast. "The book," Robert said. "When you publish it, I want you to include these letters, the photographs, all of it. Make it complete." "Are you sure they're family documents, private?" "They were private, now they're history. There's a difference." Robert turned to face him. "You know what I realized reading those letters? Our family, your blood, it's not special because of anything genetic or magical. It's special because of choice. Elijah chose to stand up at White Mountains. chose to buy Naira's freedom, chose every day for 70 years to live with integrity even when it was hard. Naira chose to forgive, chose to build a life with the man who was there when her family died. Samuel chose to work himself to death providing for his family. Daniel chose to jump on that grenade. He gripped Marcus's shoulder. And you're choosing to tell their story, to make sure people know. That's the legacy, not blood choice. And I think the world needs to understand that, needs to see that ordinary people making hard choices, that's what changes things. That's what matters. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. They went back inside, spent the rest of the afternoon going through everything in the crate. Found Naira's beadwork intricate patterns on leather Apache designs mixed with new patterns she must have invented. Found Elijah's discharge papers from the cavalry, the word dishonorable stamped across the top. Found receipts and deeds and mundane records of a life lived. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had yellowed to cream, was a small wooden box. Inside it, $6 silver, tarnished now but still intact. A note in Elijah's handwriting, "The price of freedom. Keep these. Remember what they bought. Remember what it cost. Remember it was worth it." Marcus held the coins, felt their weight. These exact coins had purchased Naira's freedom in 1883, had changed everything, had made Samuel possible, had made Daniel possible, had made Robert and Emma and Marcus himself possible. $6 silver, 140 years ago. And here they still were, still teaching, still reminding. Emma took photographs of everything. Marcus took notes. Robert told stories his grandfather had told him, filling in gaps, adding context, making the past feel present. By the time Marcus drove back to Tucson that evening, the sun setting behind him, he felt different. Lighter, but also heavier. The weight of responsibility mixed with the lightness of having more truth to work with. He spent the next week incorporating everything he'd learned, adding details from the letters, refining dialogue, making sure every word honored the people who had lived this story. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in late November, 5 years almost to the day since Elijah had died, Marcus typed the final sentence. And in the end, that was all they had ever asked for, all anyone could ask for, to be remembered, to be understood, to have mattered. He sat back, stared at the screen. 412 pages, 82,000 words. 5 years of his life. The story of Elijah and Naira as complete and true as he could make it. He saved the file, backed it up 3 times, then called Emma. "It's done," he said when she answered. "The book, it's finished." She actually screamed with joy. "I'm coming over, right now. I'm reading it tonight." "It's 400 pages. Then I'm not sleeping tonight." The sound of keys, a door slamming. "Marcus, do you understand what you've done? You've kept the promise. You've honored them. You've made sure they'll never be forgotten." After she hung up, Marcus sat in his apartment surrounded by 5 years of research, looking at the manuscript on his screen, and felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. He had done it. Whatever happened next, whether anyone published it or not, whether anyone read it or not, he had done the work, had told the story, had kept the promise to a dying man. Elijah and Naira would live on. In these pages, in these words, in the truth he had worked so hard to capture. They would teach people about courage and forgiveness and the real cost of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, someone would read it and make different choices. Better choices, harder choices that led to better outcomes. That's all any story could hope for, to change someone, to matter, to outlive the people who lived it. Marcus closed his laptop. Tomorrow he would start querying agents, would begin the next phase of turning a manuscript into a book, a private story into a public one. But tonight he would rest, would sit in the knowledge that he had honored his great-great-grandfather's faith in him, had proven worthy of the trust placed in an 18-year-old kid 5 years ago. Outside his window, stars appeared one by one, the same stars that had watched Elijah and Naira build a life from ashes. The same ancient light traveling across centuries, connecting past and present in ways that defied understanding. Marcus raised a glass of water toward the sky, a toast to people who couldn't see it but might somehow feel it. "I did it," he whispered. "I told your story. Thank you for trusting me with it." The stars offered no answer. But somewhere in whatever place the honored dead go to rest, maybe an old soldier and the woman he had loved smiled and finally truly let go of the last weight they carried. The story was told. The promise was kept. The work was done. And in a small apartment in Tucson, a 23-year-old man who carried their blood and their legacy closed his eyes and slept the sleep of those who have completed something that mattered. 3 years later, Marcus was 26. The book sat on the table between them, hardcover, with a dust jacket that showed the auction block photograph Marcus had found in territorial archives. Not Naira specifically, the image was from 1885, 2 years after her auction, but it captured the essence. A woman standing on wooden planks, men gathered below, the casual commerce of human suffering. The title in simple letters, $6 silver, the price of freedom in territorial Arizona. Below that smaller, by Marcus Stone. The publisher was a university press, not one of the big New York houses that had all passed on it. Too regional, they said, too niche. Historical narratives about unknown people didn't sell unless there was a hook, a celebrity connection, something to make it marketable. But University of Arizona Press had understood, had seen the value beyond profit margins, had worked with Marcus for 2 years, editing and fact-checking and designing a book that honored the story it told. It had been out for 6 months now, sold modestly, maybe 3,000 copies, most of them in Arizona and New Mexico. Not a bestseller, not even close. But it was being read. It was being taught. Emma used it in her classroom. Other teachers had started requesting review copies. Libraries were ordering it. And today Marcus sat in a community center in Red Willow population 842, preparing to give a reading and talk to maybe 20 people who had shown up on a Saturday afternoon. 20 people. Not a crowd, but 20 more than zero. Uncle Robert sat in the front row with Linda. Emma beside them with her laptop ready to record. A few elderly residents of Red Willow who remembered when there were still people alive who had known Elijah Stone personally. A couple of professors from the university. Some students fulfilling extra credit assignments. And in the back row, barely visible, an older woman Marcus didn't recognize. Native features. Apache, he thought, though he had learned not to assume. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, watching him with an intensity that was unnerving. The community center director, a cheerful woman named Patricia, introduced Marcus with genuine enthusiasm, talking about local history and the importance of preserving stories. Then it was his turn. He stood behind the podium, opened the book to a passage he had marked, and began to read. The auction scene. Naira on the platform. Elijah stepping forward with $6 silver. The moment everything changed. His voice was steady, practiced from a dozen smaller readings at bookstores and libraries. But this was different. This was Red Willow. This was the place it had actually happened. Some of these people might be standing in buildings built on the same ground where the auction block had stood. When he finished reading, he looked up. The audience was quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something had landed, had connected. He talked for 20 minutes about the research process, about finding Elijah's journal, about the letters and photographs, about the responsibility of telling someone else's story, especially when that story involved trauma and injustice and events most people wanted to forget. History isn't just dates and battles, he said. It's people, individual human beings making choices in impossible circumstances. Elijah Stone wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was a man carrying guilt who saw one chance to do something right and took it. Naira wasn't a victim to be saved. She was a survivor who chose to build a life with the man who bought her freedom, even knowing he'd been present when her family was killed. He paused, looked at the faces watching him. That complexity, that messiness, that's real. That's human. And I think we need stories like this now more than ever. Stories that show us people aren't simple. Situations aren't simple. But decency is still possible. Mercy is still possible. Justice, even delayed, is still possible. Question and answer followed. Someone asked about historical accuracy, about how much was documented versus imagined. Someone asked about Apache culture and whether he'd consulted with tribal historians. He had extensively, and thanked them by name in the acknowledgments. Someone asked the question he'd been dreading. As a white man writing about a Native woman's trauma, how did you navigate that ethical minefield? He had thought about this a lot, had struggled with it. I don't know if I did it perfectly, he said honestly. I tried to center Naira's humanity, her agency, her choices. I tried to avoid the white savior narrative by showing that Elijah's choice to buy her freedom was about his guilt, his need for redemption, not about him being noble. And I tried to show that Naira saved him as much as he saved her, maybe more. He paused. But I'm sure I made mistakes. I'm sure there are things I didn't see or understand fully. All I can say is I tried. I consulted with Apache historians and cultural advisors. I listened when they told me I was getting something wrong, and I hope the final result honors Naira's memory more than it exploits it. The questioner nodded, seemed satisfied, or at least willing to reserve judgment. After the formal program ended, people came up one by one, wanted books signed, wanted to share their own family stories of the territorial period, wanted to tell Marcus they'd learned something, been moved by something, would recommend the book to friends. He signed and listened and thanked them, genuinely grateful that the story was reaching people, was doing what stories were supposed to do. When the crowd thinned, the woman from the back row approached. Up close, Marcus could see she was probably 70, maybe older, silver hair in a long braid, weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors, eyes that looked familiar in a way he couldn't place. "Mr. Stone," she said. Her voice was soft but carried weight. "I'm Mary Doji. I think we might be related." Marcus felt his heart jump. "Related how?" "Your great-great-grandmother Naira. She was my great-great-aunt. My grandmother was Naira's cousin, one of the few who survived White Mountains." Mary reached into her bag, pulled out a photograph. "This is my grandmother, taken in 1930. She's wearing a necklace that belonged to Naira. Naira gave it to her in 1915, said she wanted family to have something that connected back." The photograph showed a woman in her 40s wearing traditional Apache dress and a beaded necklace with a distinctive pattern. Marcus had seen that pattern before, in the crate from the attic, in Naira's beadwork. "I didn't know," Marcus said, stunned. "I tried to find descendants, but the records are so incomplete. The government didn't keep good documentation of Apache families. They didn't keep documentation of people they were trying to erase," Mary said with a wryness that suggested she'd made peace with anger a long time ago. "But we kept our own records, oral histories, family trees that exist in memory, not on paper." She held out the photograph. "Keep it, for your research, for the archive you're building. I can't take your family photograph. I have copies. And besides, your family too. Naira's blood runs in you, same as it runs in me. Different branches, but same tree." She smiled. "I read your book. Took me 3 days. I cried through most of it. I'm sorry if it was painful. Pain and healing aren't opposites." Mary touched his arm. "You told her story with respect. You didn't make her weak. You didn't make her just a victim. You showed her strength, her choice, her life beyond trauma. That's a gift. Thank you." They talked for an hour after everyone else had left. Mary filled in gaps Marcus hadn't known existed. Told him about Naira's early life stories passed down through generations, about her skill with beadwork and horses, about her laugh which was rare but beautiful, about how she had learned English quickly because language was survival, about how the Apache community had watched from a distance as Naira built a life with Elijah. Some had judged, some had understood. Most had simply been glad she survived when so many hadn't. Did she maintain connection with Apache people? Marcus asked. The book doesn't cover that much. I didn't have documentation. Some. It was complicated. Being married to a white man living on a ranch speaking English, most of the time it created distance, but she never forgot who she was. She taught Samuel some Apache, though he never spoke it fluently. And when Apache people needed help, a place to stay, food work, the Stone Ranch was known as a safe place. Elijah and Naira helped people quietly, didn't advertise it, just did it. Marcus thought about that, about layers to the story he'd never uncovered, about how much remained hidden even after years of research. Would you be willing to talk more? He asked. I'd like to document what you know, for the historical record, for future editions of the book. Mary nodded. I'd like that. But more than that, I'd like you to meet others. There's a gathering next month, Apache families from across Arizona. We do it every year, keep connections strong. You should come, meet your relatives, hear more stories. The idea overwhelmed him. Extended family he hadn't known existed, connections stretching back through Naira to generations before, to a people and a culture that had survived attempted genocide and continued, persisted, endured. I'd be honored, he said. Mary squeezed his hand. Good. We'll see you then. After she left, Marcus stood alone in the empty community center. Robert and Linda and Emma had gone to dinner, expecting him to join them shortly. But he needed a moment, needed to process what had just happened. The story wasn't finished, would never be finished. Each telling revealed new layers, new connections, new people who carried pieces of the truth. That's what history was. Not fixed, not complete, always evolving as new voices added their perspectives, their memories, their understanding. He walked outside into late afternoon sun, drove through Red Willow past where the auction block had been, stopped there, got out, stood on asphalt that covered the ground where Naira had stood barefoot in 1883, tried to imagine it, tried to feel what she felt. Fear, yes, but also, what else? Exhaustion, resignation. Or had there been some spark of defiance, some refusal to be fully broken even when everything seemed broken? He would never know for certain, could only imagine, only guess. But standing there in the place where it had happened, he felt connected. To her, to Elijah, to all the people whose choices had made his existence possible. His phone buzzed, a text from his literary agent. Just heard from a film producer. They read the book, want to discuss adaptation rights. Interested. Marcus stared at the message. A film. The story on screen. Reaching thousands, maybe millions instead of thousands. Part of him thrilled at the possibility. Another part felt protective, worried. Would they simplify it? Would they make it a romance instead of a story about trauma and choice? Would they erase the complexity that made it true? He typed back, maybe, let's talk about it. Then he got back in his car and drove to the ranch. Not to dinner with family, not yet. To the foundation, to the place where the original cabin had stood before it burned, climbed the slope as the sun descended toward the horizon, stood on those stones that had been placed by Elijah's hands 141 years ago, stones that had survived fire and time and everything else. Pulled out his phone, called Emma. Where are you? She asked. We're at the restaurant. At the ranch, at the foundation. I need to tell you something. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. I met someone today, Mary Doji. She's Naira's family, our family. Apache descendants. She invited me to a gathering next month. Silence. Then Emma's voice, thick with emotion. That's incredible. There's more. A film producer wants to adapt the book. Marcus, that's amazing. Maybe. I don't know. I need to think about it. Need to make sure if it happens right. He looked at the horizon, at colors that reminded him of fire and blood and hope. But standing here right now, I feel like I've completed something. Like Grandpa Elijah's promise is kept. The story is out there. People are reading it. People are learning from it. And now there's family, real family, who want to connect. "Come to dinner," Emma said gently. "Come celebrate. You've earned it." He went, sat with Robert and Linda and Emma in a diner that served mediocre food with generous portions, told them about Mary, about the gathering, about the film producer. Robert raised his beer. "To Elijah and Naira, and to Marcus for making sure we remember them." They drank to that, to memory, to legacy, to stories that refused to die. Later, much later, Marcus lay in the guest room of Robert's house looking at stars through the window, thought about the path that had brought him here, from an 18-year-old in a hospital room to a 26-year-old author with a published book and family he hadn't known existed. Thought about Elijah at 18 enlisting in the cavalry, thinking he was serving something noble. At 30, standing at an auction with $6 silver and a burden of guilt. At 100, dying in a hospital after a century of trying to make one good choice balance against one terrible moment of inaction. Thought about Naira at 18, living in a village that would be destroyed. At 24, standing on an auction block. At 81, dying of tuberculosis, but having lived free for 57 years. Thought about all the space between those moments, all the days of ordinary living, all the small choices that added up to a life. That's what he wanted people to understand from the book, not just the dramatic moments, but the accumulation of days, the decision to get up every morning and keep going, to plant crops and mend fences and raise children and love someone despite everything that made love seem impossible. That was the real courage, not the one night of fire, but the 53 years after, the choosing each other every day, the building something beautiful from something broken. His phone lit up with an email from a high school teacher in Ohio who had assigned the book to her students. She attached a photo. 30 teenagers holding copies, diverse faces, different backgrounds, united by this story about people they'd never heard of who lived 140 years ago in a place most of them would never visit. The teacher wrote, "One of my students, a young Apache girl, came to me after finishing the book. She said it was the first time she'd read a story in school that showed her ancestors as real people, not stereotypes or victims. She said it made her proud. Thank you for that." Marcus read it twice, felt tears he didn't try to stop. This was why. This was the point. Not sales numbers or reviews or film deals. This, one girl seeing herself in history, seeing her ancestors honored, feeling proud. He forwarded the email to Robert, to Emma, to Mary Duchy, whose number he'd gotten before she left. Mary responded immediately, "This is how healing happens, one story at a time, one person at a time. You're doing good work, nephew." Nephew. The word hit him hard. He had a family. Not just Robert and Emma, but a whole network of relatives connected through Naira, through her survival, through her choice to live and love and build despite everything. He fell asleep thinking about the gathering next month, about meeting people who carried the same blood, the same history, the same responsibility to remember, and he dreamed, as he often did now, of a cabin that no longer existed, of two people sitting on a porch watching the sunset, of conversations without words, of love that looked like work, and work that looked like love, and the quiet satisfaction of having survived another day together. In the dream, Elijah turned to him and smiled. Rare expression, valuable because it was rare. "You did good, boy, told it true. That's all I asked." Naira beside him, her hand in his, nodded once. "Story lives. We live. Thank you." Then they turned back to the sunset, and Marcus woke to Arizona dawn, to light that looked exactly like the light that had illuminated them, to a day that stretched ahead, full of possibility. The story was told. But stories never really end. They ripple outward, touching people in ways the teller can never fully know or predict. Somewhere in Ohio, a girl was reading about Naira and seeing herself differently. Somewhere in Red Willow, an old woman named Mary was smiling, knowing her aunt's memory was honored. Somewhere in France, in a military cemetery, a grave marker stood for Daniel Stone. And maybe in whatever way the dead know things, he understood that his sacrifice had been remembered, had mattered, had meant something beyond the moment. Somewhere in a cemetery outside Red Willow, two graves side by side held the remains of Elijah and Nyra Stone. Together again after 14 years apart. Together forever in memory and stone and story. And in a guest room in a ranch house built on land, they had defended Marcus Stone, 26 years old, keeper of promises, teller of truths, carrier of legacy, woke to another day of living the story that had been passed down to him. Not finished, never finished, but continued, honored, kept alive through the most powerful magic humans have ever discovered, the magic of telling, of listening, of remembering, the magic of refusing to let the dead be forgotten or the lessons they taught be wasted, the magic of $6 silver that bought freedom and started a story that was still being told 141 years later, and would be told if Marcus and people like him had anything to say about it for 141 more. Because some stories demand to be eternal, some voices refuse to be silenced, some loves transcend death and time and everything else that tries to erase them. This was one of those stories. And Marcus Stone, great-great-grandson of Elijah and Nyra, was making sure it would never die, not while he lived, not while anyone who heard it lived, not ever. That was the promise, that was the price, that was the point. And standing at his window watching the sun rise over Stoneland, Marcus understood completely why Elijah had spent 100 years paying it. Some debts are worth carrying, some promises are worth keeping, some stories are worth telling, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. This was one of them. And the telling would continue.